Three streaming companies are currently bidding against each other for one single prize: the right to show European football's biggest club competition. The competition in question is the UEFA Champions League, along with its two smaller sister tournaments, the Europa League and the Conference League. The current broadcast rights cycle, sold back in 2024, runs through the end of the 2026-27 season. That current cycle is worth roughly £2.9 billion a year across all the markets where UEFA sells its rights. The next cycle, covering 2027 through 2031, is already being negotiated more than a year before it even begins. Early reporting on those negotiations puts the target figure at close to $5.9 billion a year, once every market is added together. Converted into pounds, that is somewhere around £4.4 billion annually, a jump of roughly 50% from the current cycle's value. To put that annual figure in perspective, it sits well above what most entire domestic football leagues generate from broadcast rights in a full season. England's Premier League, one of the most valuable domestic leagues anywhere, currently sells its own combined domestic and international rights for a comparable, but distinctly separate multi-billion figure each year. The Champions League is not a domestic league at all. It is a single midweek competition layered on top of those existing domestic seasons. That a secondary midweek competition can command broadcast fees in the same range as an entire domestic season says something about how differently it is valued.
Why would rights fees jump that sharply in a single negotiating cycle, especially with traditional television advertising under pressure almost everywhere?
The answer sits less with traditional broadcasters and more with a newer category of bidder: global streaming platforms. Reports name Netflix, Disney, and Amazon as active bidders competing for pieces of the new rights package across different territories. None of these three companies built its business around live sports rights originally. All three have spent the past several years actively moving into the category. Live sport offers something a scripted show or a film library cannot: an audience that has to watch in real time on the actual date it airs. That real-time viewing habit is exactly what a subscription streaming platform wants, because it drives signups on a predictable, recurring weekly schedule. One deal has already closed ahead of the wider 2027 auction, and it shows the pattern clearly on a smaller scale first. In May 2026, UEFA signed new media agreements worth €775 million combined, covering rights across Europe and the Americas. Inside that package, Disney Plus secured Champions League rights in select markets for the very first time in the platform's history. A dedicated entertainment streaming service adding live Champions League football is a meaningfully different kind of buyer than the sports broadcasters UEFA has sold to for decades. That single deal signaled to the rest of the market that streaming platforms were prepared to pay sports broadcaster-level money to win these rights. Beyond the headline euro and dollar totals, one specific market detail stands out clearly from UEFA's own reporting on the sales process. Across 19 markets already sold for the 2027 to 2031 cycle, television rights values are up roughly 40% compared to the prior cycle.
A 40% increase across nearly 20 separate national markets is not one lucky deal. It is a broad, consistent repricing of the entire competition.
UEFA's own commercial arm has publicly framed these results as evidence the competition remains, in their words, among the most valuable properties in global sport. None of this rights growth happens in isolation from the competition's own recent changes to its actual format on the pitch. Starting with the 2024-25 season, UEFA expanded the Champions League from 32 teams to 36. That expansion added 4 extra clubs and, more importantly for broadcasters, extra rounds of matches spread across additional midweek dates each season. UEFA justified the change at the time as a response to demand from clubs, broadcasters, and sponsors, all pushing for more high-value fixtures on the calendar. The old group stage format, with 8 groups of 4 teams, was replaced by a single 36-team league table, with every club playing 8 different opponents. More teams and more games per club means more broadcast inventory overall, more matches available to sell across more nights of the week. A bigger, more expensive rights package is, in part, simply a reflection of a bigger, more expensive competition than the one broadcasters bid on previously. Streaming platforms are not simply replacing traditional broadcasters one for one. In several major markets, the two are actively splitting the same rights package. A traditional broadcaster might retain free-to-air rights to select marquee fixtures, while a streaming platform holds exclusive rights to the bulk of the remaining matches. This layered structure is not new to sports broadcasting generally, but its scale inside Champions League rights specifically has grown with every negotiating cycle since streaming platforms entered the bidding. A market where three or more serious bidders compete for the same package behaves very differently at auction than a market with one dominant broadcaster and no real alternative. UEFA's rights sales team has structured many of the newer deals specifically to invite that kind of split bidding, rather than selling an entire market as one bundled package. That split arrangement lets UEFA capture streaming money for reach and depth, while still preserving some free mass audience exposure through conventional television. Whether that balance holds as streaming bids keep climbing is one of the open questions hanging over the entire 2027 negotiation. Money negotiated at UEFA's level does not stay at UEFA's level. A large share flows directly down to the participating clubs themselves. Clubs qualifying for the Champions League already receive a mix of fixed participation fees, performance bonuses, and a share tied to broadcast market size. A fixed participation fee is paid simply for reaching the competition's league phase, regardless of how a club actually performs once it gets there. Performance bonuses stack on top of that fixed fee for every win, every draw, and every stage of the knockout rounds a club manages to reach.
The market size share is the least predictable of the three, tied to how valuable broadcast rights are in each qualifying club's own home television market.
A club from a large broadcast-rich market can earn substantially more from that final component than a club with an identical playing record from a smaller market. A 40% rise in underlying broadcast value flows through that same distribution formula, meaning qualifying clubs stand to see meaningfully larger payouts under the new cycle. For clubs that already qualify for the competition most seasons, that translates into a widening financial gap between themselves and clubs outside continental competition entirely. Domestic leagues have introduced their own solidarity and redistribution mechanisms partly in response to exactly this widening gap driven by European broadcast money. The competitive gap inside individual domestic leagues, between clubs that regularly play in Europe and clubs that do not, tends to track this same broadcast curve closely.
There is a risk sitting underneath all of this growth that rights negotiators openly acknowledge, even while celebrating the record numbers.
Streaming platforms operate under different financial pressures than traditional broadcasters, tied closely to subscriber growth targets and investor expectations each quarter. A legacy television broadcaster typically plans sports spending against a decades-long advertising business built to absorb a weak season without pulling out of a market entirely. A streaming platform's sports spending is usually judged directly against subscriber and retention numbers reported to investors every 3 months, a much shorter feedback loop. That shorter feedback loop can cut both ways. It can justify aggressive bidding when subscriber growth is strong, and equally fast retreat when it is not. UEFA's own history offers a caution here. Rights values do not move in one direction forever, and past cycles have occasionally seen real pullbacks in specific markets. For now, though, every publicly available signal points toward growth, not caution, heading into the 2027 negotiating window. Step back from the specific dollar figures, and a larger structural story about who actually controls football's biggest revenue lines comes into focus. For most of the competition's history, a small number of national broadcasters held effective control over how fans could watch it. Streaming platforms operating across borders and outside the old national broadcaster system have broken that arrangement apart deal by deal, market by market. UEFA, as the seller, benefits directly from more competing bidders. More competition among buyers is, structurally, exactly what drives a 40% price increase. Fans, on the other hand, increasingly need multiple separate subscriptions just to follow one single competition across an entire season. A supporter who once needed a single cable package now sometimes needs a streaming subscription, a separate broadcaster app, and a free-to-air channel, just to catch every fixture. UEFA's own commercial team has acknowledged fragmented access as a real tension in these negotiations, even while continuing to prioritize the highest available bid market by market. That tension between record seller revenue and increasingly fragmented viewer access sits at the center of nearly every major sports rights negotiation happening globally right now. The 19 markets already confirmed for 2027 through 2031 are only part of the total picture. Several major markets remain unsold as this negotiation continues. Those remaining unsold markets, expected to close over the coming months, will determine whether the $5.9 billion annual target is actually reached or simply approached. Among the largest remaining unsold markets are several that carry outsized weight in the final total, given the size of their advertising and subscription economies. UEFA has generally chosen to finalize smaller markets first in past cycles, saving the largest and most competitive markets for later in the sales process. Whatever the final number turns out to be, the 40% increase already confirmed across 19 markets sets a clear floor for how the negotiation ends. A streaming platform's decision to bid aggressively for European football rights was never really about football alone. It was about subscriber numbers, engagement minutes, and renewal habits. Football simply happens to be one of the very few products left that can reliably deliver all three of those things every single week for 9 months a year. That reliability is precisely what a $5.9 billion annual rights fee is actually paying for. Compound World covers the events, decisions, and power structures that shape the world economics, finance, sports, and beyond. Grounded in real data, no hot takes, no manufactured outrage,